Open is mainly about access, about in many places education is blocked from some people. People cannot reach it because of money, because of examinations that you have to pass in order to study, because of time, because of disabilities, physical disabilities, mental disabilities. For me, the most important part of in open education is that anyone can reach it, anyone can get it. So that includes, for example, open, many times people think of as free. So that's open. Many times open means that you can also modify it, that you can, like open source, okay, like in software, that you can take it and adapt it to your own needs. So oftentimes that is also important, because when I'm an educator, I might want to take education from that somebody else, a textbook that somebody else is using, and adapt it to my own, to the needs of my population, to the needs of my culture, to the need, etc. So in that respect, open is important. But first and foremost, it's about opening it up to people who cannot reach education in other ways. So I'm not saying that the other definitions of open are not important, but if you're saying what for me is the most important thing, it is. It is about access. And this is one of the things we do at the Israeli Open University. There are, when you come as a student, there are no admissions requirements. Anyone can study undergraduate for first degree, not for a master's. For a master's, you need to have an undergraduate degree. You have to have a bachelor's degree. But for a bachelor's degree, there are no requirements, only to succeed in the first course, in the second course, etc., etc. Financially, it's not free. You do have to pay, but it is state tuition, which is subsidized by the state. And to the best of my knowledge, anyone who cannot afford that will receive funding or subsidies or other ways to study. So money practically is not an issue for students. So also it's open also in that respect, although, if it was totally free, it would have been even nicer. Oftentimes education is closed because it is expensive. It costs a lot of money, and it is open only if you can afford the money. In other ways, it's also closed if you don't have the social capital. If you don't, for example, we know that there is a big difference between students whose parents or family have studied in higher education and students who have parents or family members who already have academic education. They are more likely to succeed as students than what we call first generation students. A lot of higher education is also closed because of cultural aspects. So higher education in the world is relatively, oriented towards Western culture, developed countries. A lot of it is relatively Americanized. It's biased towards English. And that's another way that it is to some extent closed. But here it's a little difficult because sometimes you get an academic education in order to better connect with developed countries. So when you come from a developing country, should the higher education be something that keeps you separate from the world, from the big world, or not? So I don't have a good answer there, but that's another way that education is closed. You have copyright, which is an issue. It is something that closes education. So that's another way that education is closed. But I think it has to do with a financial part, because most of the copyrighted works, if you pay money, it becomes open. It requires money to open. So that's that.
Yes.
So I think these are the main ways in which higher education is closed. You can also say that higher education is closed in being conservative, which is funny, but it is. And also and we know that more from, but I mean the role of national educational systems is usually, to close things. It's you don't want the children to be all over the place. There's a social role of schools to put students into a specific structure. Structure, or even I forgot the word that used for cookies, like standards. To make them relatively standard. So that's also a way that higher education is closed, or any type of education. But then again, you need some structures. I am not an expert in pedagogy. I come to higher education from a more organizational perspective. I look at higher education institutions as organizations. When you talk about pedagogy, the main tool that I think is important in opening up education are pedagogies that involve the students more. So many pedagogies assume that the knowledge is with the professor or with the teacher, and that the student is empty. That you pour your knowledge into the head of the student. There have always been, since Socrates, there have always been approaches that say learning is a collaborative process. But most learning happens when one person sits and everyone else listens. I am very not only interested, but also try to encourage pedagogical approaches that are about collaborating with the students, about back and forth with the students, about moving the professor from being here and the student here to bring them to the same level and bring them together, because the more you talk about not only knowledge but also skills, there needs to be interaction. And we use an open platform, we use Moodle, but we also work with other platforms. We do some work on edX, which is also open. We don't do any work on commercial platforms, but mainly for ideology, but also a lot of, Israel is a small country, not just Hebrew and Arabic. Remember that we also need to work in Arabic. For about 10-15 years we also worked in Russian, because many people moved from the former Soviet Union to Israel. So about, I think, 15% of Israel are formerly from the Soviet Union. So we also needed Russian, and of course we always need English. So everything happens in several languages, and open platforms are better for that. We did a MOOC, for example. We had some of the MOOCs were in Hebrew, and we had a MOOC in Russian, for example. We had a MOOC in Arabic, and then we had two MOOCs one MOOC, two MOOCs in Hebrew, but also one of the MOOCs was both in English and in Hebrew in separate places. And so one of the big challenges of any, as I said, of any educational institution is people for whom education is more difficult. You said, in which way is it closed? So being a minority in most countries also keeps you slightly away from, makes it more difficult for you to study. So for Ethiopian, oftentimes they are what I said, first generation. So
Yes.
their parents, they might have very few relatives who know what academic education is about. So
Yes.
they don't know from home what needs to be done, what is important, how the whole thing works. So that's one difficulty. For many of them, Hebrew is already a second language, and then English is a third language,
Yes.
which makes it, again, difficult because academic education in Israel uses a lot of English. Many things you study in English, and you have to have that. At the Open University, we have a special unit that works with Ethiopian community to help them with these difficulties. But it's an important challenge, but it's not an easy challenge. And I think it has to do with the open ethos, because again, in Open University, our main challenge is not to teach, the standard student who can go to any other university, but rather teach someone who cannot attend another university, or for whom it's difficult to attend another university. And the Ethiopian community is one of these communities, and there are many others in Israel. You have the Arab community. I'm talking about the Israeli Arabs, the Israeli Arab Palestinians, towns and villages. You have ultra-Orthodox. It's a problem for everyone, but for some groups it's even more problematic. Overall, higher education is slowly becoming more and more open. But I think the interesting part is not places like ours, open universities, but rather to what extent do traditional universities become more open. Still, most students study in traditional universities, not in open universities. And we can be the revolutionaries. There aren't many revolutions in higher education. It was one of the only ones. And the success of that revolution is when traditional universities become more open. Listen.